Imagine the government passes a law that requires you and only people who look like you to carry identification papers at all times. If you're caught without them, you face immediate deportation. No trial, no due process, just arrest and removal from the only home you've known. Now imagine that in response, your entire community, over 100,000 people, decides to simply refuse. They won't register, they won't comply. They'll risk everything on a mass act of civil disobedience so massive that the government literally cannot enforce its own law. This isn't a dystopian novel. This happened in America in 1892, and the resistance was led by Chinese immigrants who organized one of the largest civil disobedience movements in American history, a movement most Americans have never heard about. This is the story of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. But more importantly, it's the story of how an entire community fought back against institutionalized racism and won battles that changed constitutional law forever. Let's talk about resistance. Between 1850 and 1870, more than 200,000 Chinese immigrants entered the United States. They called America Gamsan, the Golden Mountain. They came for the California Gold Rush. They built the Transcontinental Railroad, literally laying the tracks that connected America coast to coast, often doing the most dangerous work that white laborers refused. They worked in mines. They established laundries, restaurants, and businesses. They paid their taxes. They followed the law. And America rewarded them with hatred. As the economy fluctuated in the 1870s, white workers, particularly in California, began scapegoating Chinese laborers. The rhetoric was vicious. Chinese workers were accused of stealing jobs, depressing wages, being unassimilable, bringing disease. Labor leader Denise Kearney became famous for ending his speeches with the rallying cry, "The Chinese must go." It didn't matter that Chinese immigrants were essential to the American economy. It didn't matter that they'd built critical infrastructure. It didn't matter that they were peaceful, industrious, and law-abiding. What mattered was that they looked different, spoke different languages, and practiced different customs. And in the eyes of many white Americans, that made them a threat. Congress decided to act. And the laws they passed would fundamentally reshape American immigration policy for generations. First came the Page Act of 1875, ostensibly designed to bar undesirable immigrants, contract laborers, and prostitutes. It was really targeted at Chinese women. The law made it nearly impossible for any Chinese or East Asian woman to enter the United States, effectively preventing Chinese men from starting families in America. Then came the big one, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, signed by President Chester A. Arthur on May 6, 1882. It banned all Chinese laborers, skilled or unskilled, from entering the United States for 10 years. It was the first federal law to explicitly exclude an entire ethnic group. Chinese already in America were denied the path to citizenship. If they left the country, they needed special certificates to return, and the law defined Chinese laborers so broadly that almost no one could qualify for the exemptions. For the first time in American history, federal law said, "Your race makes you undesirable. Your ethnicity disqualifies you from the American dream." The Chinese population in the United States began to plummet. In 1880, there were approximately 105,000 Chinese in America. By 1900, that number had dropped to 89,000. By 1920, just 61,000 remained. But Congress wasn't done. When the 10-year exclusion period expired in 1892, they doubled down. May 5, 1892, Congress passed the Geary Act, named after California Representative Thomas J. Geary. The law renewed Chinese exclusion for another 10 years, but it went much further. The Geary Act required all Chinese residents in the United States, even those who had lived in America for decades, to register with the federal government within 1 year. They had to obtain certificates of residence, proving they'd entered legally. These certificates became known in the Chinese community as dog tags. And here's the truly draconian part. Any Chinese person caught without a certificate faced immediate arrest and deportation or a year of hard labor. Chinese residents couldn't testify in their own defense in habeas corpus proceedings, and they needed at least one credible white witness to prove they were entitled to stay. Think about that. You're a Chinese immigrant who's lived in America for 20 years. You've built a business. You've raised a family. You've paid your taxes. And now the government says you must register and carry papers proving your right to exist in this country or face deportation. And if you're arrested, your word means nothing. Only a white person's testimony can save you. The Geary Act turned Chinese residents into what one dissenting Supreme Court justice later called ticket of leave men, essentially former prisoners who could be rearrested at any time for not carrying their papers. This was institutionalized racial surveillance. This was making an entire ethnic group presumed illegal until they could prove otherwise. And the Chinese community had had enough. Within months of the Geary Act's passage, Chinese organizations across America began mobilizing. From coast to coast, community groups coordinated an unprecedented response. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, also known as the Six Companies, led the charge in San Francisco. The Chinese Equal Rights League organized on the East Coast. On September 19, 1892, the Six Companies issued a public call. Do not register. Do not comply. Instead, contribute $1 to fund a legal challenge. The strategy was brilliant. They would make a constitutional argument. The Geary Act violated due process rights guaranteed by the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. It violated treaty obligations between the United States and China, and they would take it all the way to the Supreme Court. But here's the truly extraordinary part. They called for mass civil disobedience. Over 100,000 Chinese residents were urged to refuse registration and risk deportation, rather than submit to what they saw as an unjust, unconstitutional law. And they listened. The Chinese community wasn't alone. White allies joined the fight. On September 22, 1892, more than 1,000 American citizens joined 200 Chinese merchants and laborers at Cooper Union in Manhattan to protest the Geary Act. William Lloyd Garrison, junior son of the famous abolitionist, became a passionate advocate. He compared the Geary Act to the Fugitive Slave Law, calling it one of the most infamous enactments to disgrace American statute books since slavery. The Chinese government protested diplomatically. Chinese Minister Yang Ru spoke publicly about reciprocity if America excluded Chinese. Perhaps China should exclude Americans. The tensions were real enough that the San Francisco Call declared in September 1892 that the Geary Act may lead to war, but the most powerful resistance came from ordinary Chinese residents who simply refused to register. April 1893. The registration deadline arrived. Out of an estimated 110,000 Chinese living in the United States, only about 3,000 had registered. Only 14% compliance. 86% of Chinese residents risked deportation rather than submit to the law. This was one of the largest acts of civil disobedience in American history, and it created an immediate crisis for the federal government. Congress had authorized only $60,000 for enforcement, but the cost of arresting and deporting as many as 85,000 unregistered Chinese was estimated at more than $7 million. The government literally couldn't afford to enforce its own law. Meanwhile, legal challenges were moving through the courts. 3 test cases, Fong Yue-ting, Wang Quan, and Li Zhou, were arrested for not having certificates. All 3 challenged their detention through writs of habeas corpus, and all 3 cases went to the Supreme Court. The Chinese community held its breath. Everything depended on what the court would decide. May 15, 1893. The Supreme Court issued its decision in Fong Yue-ting versus United States, and it was devastating. In a 5-3 ruling, the court upheld the Geary Act. The majority opinion, written by Justice Horace Gray, declared that Congress had plenary power, absolute authority over immigration. The government could exclude or deport any class of aliens it wanted, and requiring Chinese to register with certificates didn't violate due process because deportation wasn't considered punishment, it was simply the enforcement of immigration policy. The 3 dissenters were furious. Justice David Brewer wrote that deportation was absolutely punishment. Everyone knows that to be forcibly taken away from home and family and friends and business and property and sent across the ocean to a distant land is punishment, and that oftentimes most severe and cruel. Chief Justice Melville Fuller warned that the Geary Act contained the germs of the assertion of an unlimited and arbitrary power, in general, incompatible with the immutable principles of justice. But they were outvoted. The Geary Act stood. The Chinese community faced a choice: continue resisting and face mass deportation, or comply with an unjust law. They chose both. The practical reality was that the federal government couldn't deport 85,000 people. It was logistically impossible, financially impossible, politically complicated given China's threats of retaliation. Congress passed the McCreary Amendment in November 1893, extending the registration deadline by 6 months and making some modifications. More Chinese registered under this extension, but compliance was still far from universal. Then came a second legal victory that the Chinese community had been fighting for. In 1896, the Supreme Court decided Wong Wing versus United States. This case challenged the Geary Act's provision for imprisonment at hard labor, and the court ruled 9-0 that the imprisonment provisions violated the Fifth and Sixth Amendments. Justice George Shiros Jr. wrote that while Congress could deport aliens without a trial, imposing hard labor was criminal punishment, and criminal punishment required due process, including a jury trial. It wasn't a complete victory. The registration requirement and deportation provisions remained in place, but the Chinese resistance had forced a constitutional limit on government power. They'd established that even non-citizens in America were entitled to some constitutional protections, and the mass civil disobedience had made the law essentially unenforceable as originally written. The Geary Act was extended in 1902 with no terminal date, making Chinese exclusion permanent. It stayed in effect for decades. Chinese immigrants developed creative strategies to circumvent the laws. The paper son system, where young Chinese men used purchased identity papers claiming to be sons of American citizens. Between 1882 and 1905, more than 10,000 lawsuits relating to Chinese immigration and civil rights were filed in federal courts. The Chinese community didn't just accept discrimination, they fought back through the legal system despite coming from a country without a litigious tradition. They learned American law. They hired lawyers. They won cases declaring anti-Chinese ordinances unconstitutional. And they created a template. The Chinese Exclusion Act became the model for broader immigration restrictions. The Immigration Act of 1917 created an Asiatic barred zone. The Immigration Act of 1924 imposed national origin quotas that severely limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and banned virtually all Asian immigration. The exclusion laws weren't repealed until 1943 during World War II, when China was an American ally and the racist laws became a propaganda liability. The Magnuson Act repealed Chinese exclusion, but allowed only 105 Chinese immigrants per year, a token gesture at best. Real reform didn't come until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 finally abolished the national origins quota system. So what's the legacy of Chinese exclusion and resistance? First, it established the legal doctrine of plenary power, the idea that Congress has near absolute authority over immigration with minimal judicial review. That doctrine still shapes immigration law today. Courts still defer to Congress, and the executive branch on immigration matters in ways they wouldn't for almost any other area of law. Second, it demonstrated that institutionalized racism could be written into federal law and upheld by the Supreme Court. The Chinese Exclusion Acts were explicitly race-based. They said certain people were undesirable because of their ethnicity, and the highest court in America said that was constitutional. But third, and perhaps most importantly, it showed the power of organized resistance. When over 100,000 people engage in coordinated civil disobedience, when they refuse to comply with unjust laws, when they fight back through every available channel, they can limit the power of even the federal government. The Chinese community in 1892 couldn't stop the Exclusion Acts, but they made them harder to enforce. They won constitutional protections through the courts. They created networks of support and resistance that sustained their community through decades of legal hostility. They refused to disappear quietly.